we go.
All right.
Good.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Jim.
So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to pass around these orange slips. Each person gets one orange slip. If you would, write down the name of who your favorite reader today was, and then we'll count these up.
Somewhat historical, I hope. It's called The Ogre. I'll trade you this moose scouring for your Snyder. You're nuts. What do you mean nuts? 'Cause scouring stinks. Billy was ready to fight. He was always ready to fight, especially when it came to the Yankees. What a dumb bastard. I knew he was only interested in my Snyder as potential trade bait for a mantle. Most Dodger fans would trade a good mantle for a Snyder in comparable condition. The truth was, the only Dodgers I would ever trade away for a stinking Yankee were subs, like Andy Pafko or George Shuba. The Yankees stink. It was all very political and had almost nothing to do with baseball. We were sitting in a vacant lot amid the oleo of weeds, broken bottles, brick, beer cans. A mix of the remnants of some long-forgotten warehouse and the usual bunch of trash people routinely throw from their car windows or leave behind after staggering drunkenly away. There were several of us present in our daily uniforms of dungarees with bunched-up waistlines belted nearly to the armpits of our striped polos. Dungarees, single-cuffed, 6, 8, 10 inches, depending on how far in the future our parents had planned for. Sneakers, U.S. Keds, dirty and some flapping in overuse. We all lived in one of the 6-story apartment buildings in the neighborhood, eagerly gathered here, fresh from running and shrieking out of our parents' doors in the promise of a long summer day spent in idleness, intrigue, and adventure. We were the grandchildren of the Great Immigration and children of the Great Depression. We had not shrugged off the influence of either. We were the flotsam of the melting pot of New York City. But we would grow up with the hope that our individuality could overshadow the relative poverty and misfortune of our ancestors who had come to deliver us here. War was our major pastime, still fresh in movie, TV, and radio. War and baseball. What else was there? Our parents pushed us out of the door as soon as we could cross wide Metropolitan Avenue by ourselves. They didn't worry about kidnappings, sexual predators, or play dates. They had enough worries of their own, just keeping us fed without having sniveling brats screeching around the house. My parents both worked, which made me a free agent when I wasn't in school. Besides, my mother perfected worrying to an art form, and she did her best worrying unencumbered by having to attend to my every need. And there was plenty to worry about. Don't play in the dirt. Why? Just for once in your life, listen to your mother. But why can't I play in the dirt? Always with the questions. But why, Ma? Because you'll get polio, that's why. There you go. Now, my mother was and still is a fairly intelligent person, albeit slightly irrational at times. But the idea that playing in the dirt could result in polio was a widely accepted fact among mothers across America. The other possible cause was running around like a, this in quotation marks, wild Indian and getting too overheated. Overheated? Have you ever spent the summer in New York in a 6th-floor apartment without air conditioning? It wasn't just the wild Indians getting overheated. You could get overheated just thinking. Your average worried mother had no idea what caused polio. My cousin Joyce had been stricken by it, and my mom thought about it all the time. The exact nature of which particular kind of dirt was a culprit was up for extensive family debate. What is dirt? Dirt is a fairly generic term for anything that gets you dirty. For a 6-year-old kid, everything you could possibly get into is dirt, especially if you're hanging out in vacant building lots. Since she finally realized that dirt was unavoidable, the admonition not to play in it became enough for her. If I got polio, it was my own fault. She was absolved of any future guilt. I had to take responsibility for the type of dirt I got into. I promised myself that I wouldn't whine when the inevitable dreaded attack occurred. One night, just to prevent me from becoming a nervous wreck like my mother, we watched some show on TV about a guy who had to live in an iron lung because he was totally paralyzed by polio. This was my first introduction to the iron lung. They had a mirror attached to the iron lung above his face so that the only thing he could do all day was look at his reflection. After that, I had the recurring image in my mind of me being in the lung with my mother sitting in a chair next to me, weeping and wringing her hands as my father snored in the next room. We were a fun family. The next most likely catastrophe that was just waiting to happen was, of course, nuclear annihilation. We lived with the bomb. The fear was the fabric of Americana. If you lived in New York, you were a sure target. Basements of apartment buildings and dusty coal bins became public fallout shelters. Of course, there were no provisions for future survival stocked away, but survival of the initial blast seemed like enough. Once again, ignorance ruled the day. New York City public schools issued dog tags so that parents could identify the remains of their beloved children. We were endlessly drilled to duck and cover under ancient 19th century desks with fold-up seats. Stay away from the windows. Huddle in masses in the hallways. Listen to your teacher if you ever want to see your mother's smiling, terrified face. Oh, Mark was such a good boy. Too bad he had to be melted down to a small mound of flesh. At least we were able to identify his body due to his dog tag. And the commies were ruining everybody's life, and of course they were everywhere. They possibly held every public office, hid in every closet, resided under every bed. We were the three little pigs. They could possibly be our pastor or our rabbi. Last names were a main subject of scrutiny, and how many were changed to protect the innocent. In between Dodger baseball, Howdy Doody, Ed Sullivan, and the $1 Million Movie, Senator Joe McCarthy and his Red Hunting Committee filtered into our lives through our tiny secondhand TV. His visage was more hated in our household than Hitler's. At least Hitler was dead. My mother would cry as we watched the lives of innocent, true patriots dashed. Roy Cohen, the House on Un-American Activities Committee lawyer, was the most vilified of all, a Jew. A Jew joining in on the blood sport. One of my clearest childhood recollections of that period was a day in 1953 when the family was driving out to Long Island to visit our cousins who had managed to escape New York City. We were in our very first car, which was a 1946 black Buick four-door that my father purchased secondhand from an old Army buddy of my Uncle Mo. It was the sort of vehicle that very well could have turned the war around for the Axis powers if they had had a division of them in their arsenal. The floor space between the back and front seat was large enough to conduct extensive war maneuvers, as my brother and I usually did. The radio dial was round, and I vividly remember the announcer's crackling voice somberly relate the news that the Rosenbergs had consecutively been executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison, only a very few miles away. And my mother cried, and I asked why, and she told me. And what she told me was that they were burned not because they were spies, but because our government had framed them in order to give us something to fear. And pressure had been put on their associates to pin the heinous crime of treason on a harmless pair of citizens whose only crime were their beliefs and their heritage. I do not know if that is true, but I suspect it is. More importantly, at the time, I believed it was true, and how could I not be political at the age of 7? And how could I not be a devotee to the underdog, the oppressed? The poor working stiff, those hated and abused merely for who they happened to be. My parents showed me who the real enemy was, but also taught me to keep a low profile, lest I suffer the same fate. Fear is contagious. I once asked my father, during one of his rare moments of wakefulness, how Billy Fields could be a Yankee fan. He got that philosophical look on his face when he thought he was about to impart some knowledge on my noggin, and replied that there were one of only 2 explanations. What's that, Pop? Well, for one thing, they could be from the Bronx. From the Bronx? Yeah, the Bronx. If that's the case, I really feel sorry for the poor bastards. What's the other case, Pop? The old man sort of steeled himself for the next measured words as he gritted his teeth. The other case, son, is that they are goddamn Republicans. Well, that's what baseball was like in New York. A political struggle between the rich and poor, management and union, the Joe McCarthys and freethinkers, the white folks whose entitlement was America, and the not-so-whites who would always have to look over their shoulder. The Dodgers represented the hope of the underdog to persevere in the face of insurmountable odds. Every time Jackie Robinson played baseball, got a hit, got spit on, stole a base, was spiked, was hooted at, jeered, insulted as a man, or triumphed in spite of it all, the whole nation watched, and an entire race of people held their breath as if their future was at stake. And maybe it was. The moneyed, successful, lily-white Yankees were the enemy, and for the life of me, I could not figure how this dirty little kid, Billy Fields, in his brother's hand-me-down ripped sneakers could be a Yankee fan. Take that back. The Yankees stink, and Skowron stinks, and the Mick stinks, too. This was too much for Billy to handle, and the inevitable scuffle ensued. But everybody joined in and piled on, and what resulted was a free-for-all that ended in riotous laughter and giggles. We all went running through the basement of the nearest apartment building, which was where Billy lived. That brings me to the ogre. Of all my childhood fears, the existence of the ogre was the most intense because he was a real, live, tangible boogeyman. Someone you could wrap your arms around if you dared. All the buildings in the neighborhood had a super who resided with his family in what was called the basement. There weren't really basements, but first floors, with floors of apartments above. These denizens of the deep were by and large dark, looming, hulking figures who shoveled the coal into the furnace and generally were available for full-time maintenance. The much maligned supers were, of course, just regular family men doing crappy, hard, dirty work. But they didn't like roving bands of screaming, ungrateful kids running through their milieu. It was their calling to chase us out, which, of course, was what made us run through in the first place. Our own super, Rufus, was a big gentleman who showed me how the furnace worked and other secrets of the building's innards. He had huge brown hands, and I would gaze in wonderment at his calloused pink palms. Mom, why is Rufus's hand so brown and his palms pink? The ogre was another story. He was the super in Billy's building. You never got to see all of the ogre in the light of day. He would come outside to deal with the trash and other chores, but you could only catch incomplete snapshots of his hulking, shuffling essence, the plodding, menacing steps of a disturbing, putrid smell as you passed by the building. And he had a rep. Rumors ran rampant among us kids about children mysteriously disappearing, and no doubt being eaten by the ogre and his hideously haggard witch of a wife. Billy's building was one place we stayed away from, and the fact that he had to live there somewhat elevated his otherwise snotty little existence in our eyes. You guys ready? We ain't really going down there, are we, Billy? Yous guys ain't chicken, are you? I don't know about yous guys, but I sure as hell was. I got a watery feeling in my bowels as my rubber legs followed the crowd down Curzon Road. My heart hammered in my chest, and I sweated like a wild Indian. We were inside the tomb of his lair now, as the steel door slammed behind us. The silence was unbearable, an unbearable backdrop to any noise or movement which could identify his presence. Then someone started to scream, and as we all started screaming, as our spindly legs churned in a mad rush for the safety of the outside world, we didn't stop running for 3 blocks, where we stood with hands on knees, panting and taking stock of any casualties. And Billy was missing. I have not seen him since. That was more than 50 years ago. I have a vivid memory, but also deep regret about the country I was raised in, about a time that has been lost forever, when kids could roam free on a summer day. I cannot tell if I'm just growing old or that indeed was a time of freedom that we have let slip through our fingers. Has our unyielding conformity in an attempt to protect ourselves from the ogre cost us too dearly to ever recover? Fears, real or imagined, have been blown all out of proportion by those who have the most to lose. They need us to man our posts. We sacrifice our muscle, bone, and sinew of mind for very little in return. Many years ago, I worked at a furniture factory. During the long 1-hour lunch break, I was shocked to see how many lifers sat at their machines and ate their meal. If we do not behave ourselves, who will be left to fight their wars? A couple of months ago, I struck up a conversation with a woman of roughly my age that I met at a social function. It turned out that she was from the old neighborhood and was in fact Billy Field's little sister. I told her the story of our run-in with the ogre, and she started to laugh. The ogre? I never knew you boys called him that. That was my Uncle Leo. We all adored him. Then what happened to Billy? We moved to Chicago. Billy went to college there and became very financially successful. He donates a huge portion of his wealth to a Votech school for high school dropouts. Is he still a stinking Yankee fan? Oh, my word, no. The Cubs.